RAM and you have Vista and you want to run CS5 Photoshop, it's going to be slow. I mean, it will run. If you have enough hard drive space, it will swap. Okay, it will swap, a lot to make the program run. But it will be so slow that even this is one good example of how a quad-core processor is not going to be very helpful. You get the latest and greatest i7 processor, and if you don't have enough RAM and you have a lot of hard drive space, the program is going to run like a dog. I mean, it's just going to be slow. 1 gig of available hard drive space for installation. Okay, so you need 1 gig just to install the program. Additional free space required during installation. So a rule of thumb is if it takes 1 gigabyte to install, you might want to have 2 gigabytes available during the installation process, because the installation process sometimes will, or typically, will double the requirement of what it is actually needed for the installed product. And the third one, this one is also kind of funny because it says, oh, well, the minimum requirement is a 1024 by 768 display, which is the current resolution on this screen. What do you think of it? And you want to do what? Photo editing?
Yeah. Using
a 1024 by 768, otherwise known as, is it called XGA? Yeah, that's XGA resolution. That's not enough. That is not nearly enough, to do this sort of, work. With qualified hardware accelerated OpenGL graphics card, 16-bit color, and 256 megabytes of video RAM, some GPU accelerated features require graphics support for Shader Model 3.0 and OpenGL 2.0. Not so sure, about this one, because I don't use that product. DVD, ROM drive, QuickTime required for multimedia features, broadband internet connection required for online services. In other words, it's not telling you a whole lot. I mean, this is completely misleading. Okay, because in reality, if you have a system, let's say you have Windows 7 installed, and you want to run CS5 Photoshop, you typically need a much higher resolution monitor. Something with 1600 at least, by 1000 or so of resolution, pixels in terms of pixels, would be helpful. Because otherwise, if you guys have used products like this, you will know what I'm talking about. This is your screen. The top part, would be like the menus and whatnot, and then they have a toolbar on one side, and there are certain things that can pop up, that will take up additional spaces. And then the bottom part here is a status bar. Okay, if your screen is small, that means your working area is going to be like tiny. Okay, you can only see a small fraction of the picture that you're editing at any particular time. Okay, which is very inconvenient, because if you want to crop out an object, the object will not fit entirely on the screen, because you cannot zoom out and do the cropping. You got to zoom in at least to 1-to-1 ratio in order to do cropping. Okay, to select which area to crop. Now, tell me what is the current standard of a $100 consumer type digital camera? How many megapixels are we talking about these days? If I go to Fry's now, with $100, what type of resolution will I be getting for $100? 8 at least.
Yeah.
I would say at least 8 megapixels, maybe a little more. Okay, but 8 megapixels is a lot better. Is a lot better than 1024 by 768. So what that means is even at a at a lower resolution with a digital camera today, you will have to pan this. Let's say this is 1024 by 768. Okay, this entire screen is 1024 by 768. By 768. A typical picture today from a digital camera is 1-to-1. Okay, using the 1-to-1 ratio. The picture itself is about this big. The big rectangle represents the digital picture at a 1-to-1 ratio, 1 pixel for 1 pixel. Yep.
On New Wave, $75 to $100
yep.
Point and shoots have a 12 to 16 megapixel range.
There you go. 16 is even bigger. Okay, this is probably what 3,000 pixels by 2,000 pixels. So this is only like a 6 megapixel type of image. Okay, with a 12 megapixel, it is not exactly twice as big because we're talking about a square of stuff, but it will go all the way kind of down to here, down to the this part here, and it will extend all the way up to here. If your screen is only 1024 by 768, can you imagine how much panning you will need in order to do anything? Okay, so that gives you an idea of why a bigger screen is always more helpful when it comes to photo editing. Are you guys getting the idea? Are you also getting the idea why this is useless? Yeah. It's kind of like saying, you want to get into racing, right? Okay, and the minimum requirement is, well, you have to have at least 1.0 liter of displacement with your car. Okay, but because that's exactly what a Geo Metro has. Okay, 1.0 liter. Yep.
So you'd be better off looking for information on like a benchmark type site, some place that was testing something.
You probably want to ask information on certain forums, just so that you know how other people set up a system for Photoshop. Or if you know people who use Photoshop, just ask those people what they think is a bare minimum to make it usable. This is not usable. This is like, it will run, and that's about it. It will start up. You can see Photoshop. Okay, it started up close because it's not going to be very useful. Okay, so that's not very helpful. If you know someone with Photoshop already installed and have run Photoshop, the other thing that is nice is you can ask that person to use Control-Alt-Delete or Control-Shift-Escape, something that you guys taught me last time, to go into Task Manager. And then inside Task Manager, you can actually look up how much RAM that particular program is using. So that is useful because now you know exactly how much RAM it is using when it is being run and editing like 2 or 3 photos at the same time. Much more realistic that way. Okay. Do we have any questions at this point? Okay. In other words, we still could not find a good answer to tell us how much RAM is needed. And besides, you don't really have a whole lot of control. If it's not 4 gigabytes, its next step up is 8 gigabytes. Right. You can configure a system to have 6 gigabytes because you can put two 2 gigabyte memory modules in 2 slots and then 2 1 gigabyte modules in the other 2. But that tends to be kind of like a rare configuration, especially when you're putting a new system together. We typically do not set up systems like that. Yep.
Set it up just so you can have your computer, and then later you can switch it out when you have more money.
Yep. That upgrading, a system after upgrading would have odd numbers like that. But when you put a new system together, it is kind of rare that people would put in kind of odd numbers like that. Okay. So once you have determined the processor and the RAM, the next thing that to put everything together will be the motherboard. But the motherboard is a big topic all by itself because on the motherboard are many resources. The first few things you have to remember is the motherboard, the socket type has to match the processor. Okay, that's the first and most important criteria, is to make sure if you select socket 1156 as the processor, then you have to make sure that your motherboard supports exactly the same type of socket. Okay, the socket number, as I said, mentioned previously, refers to the number of pins of the processor. Okay, so 1156 means there are 1,156 pins on the socket itself. And that all by itself is pretty amazing too. I mean, if you flip and look at the backside of a processor and just look at the number of pins, they're not pins, they're basically contact points, because the pins is actually on the socket itself. The processor itself does not have pins, it has contact points. Okay, it's still kind of amazing that they can put like 1,000 pins, to the back of a chip only about this big. and have the technology to make it reliable so that even I can put a system together without risking one of the pins not making good contact. So that's actually pretty amazing. I think it's amazing. Okay, so you have to make sure your memory type is correct. And that part, I think, is pretty hard to mess up these days because all newer processors from AMD or Intel, they all use DDR3 memory. I mean, there's no way. I don't think there are anyone who can kind of mess this up because almost all new systems use DDR3. So I'll just say they're mostly DDR3. The only time it can be confusing is if someone has an existing system using socket 775. So that's a previous generation, Core 2 generation chip, and somehow the motherboard itself died. Okay, which happened to me. My $200 motherboard died, but I have everything else that is still completely functional. So I didn't want to buy or upgrade to an entirely new system, which would have costed me $400 for almost nothing, because I feel comfortable with the processing speed that I have. All the resources that I have were just were already plentiful when the motherboard died. All I wanted is a new motherboard to basically serve the purpose of the motherboard and keep everything else the same. I looked up online, and obviously go to Newegg or some other resources and look up motherboards that support socket 775. And guess what? Some of those motherboards specify DDR3 memory instead of DDR2 memory. Okay, so that part was a little bit confusing because socket 775 type processors are usually associated with DDR2 memory because that's the generation of memory corresponding to the Core 2 technology. The reason why they have DDR3 memory for those motherboards is because the older processors do not have heads of front side bus, so it's actually the chipset that is talking to the memory and not the processor chip itself. So by changing the chipset, the motherboard also has to change the type of memory it has to support. But on the other hand, when you specify a Core I processor, the current generation of processor, the processor talks directly to memory, and the processor wants to talk DDR3, and as a result, I don't think there should be any confusion as to what type of memory to get. DDR3 should be the one for almost every single new processor. Any questions about this part? Yep.
Do other machines design motherboards, or if you get prepared to the person that comes out to fix it, does it have like a skill of a surgeon?
They can tell right away. I mean, if you extract the memory module and just look at it, you can tell right away whether it's DDR2 or DDR3. DDR2 and DDR3 memory modules are not physically compatible. In other words, you cannot take a DDR3 memory module and plug it into a DDR2 memory slot. Well, not properly anyway. I guess you can always jam something in, so it kind of sticks there. Or someone would say, "Oh, I need an extra notch. Here comes the Dremel, right?" Yeah, that would not be good. Yeah. But they're not physically compatible. The notch, is at a different place. They carefully place these notches on the memory modules, so it is completely tack-proof. Okay. And when it comes to hardware and configuration stuff, I'm kind of all thumbs. So I would try to plug in things, backwards and whatnot. And the memory modules are designed physically so that is not possible. The only thing I can do is not plugging in all the way. I mean, it would fit. I may not press it all the way in for the end clamps to clamp in. That's the only mistake, anyone can make these days with memory modules.
So is it best to buy a new motherboard then? If they look old and faded?
It depends on how old. If it's socket 775, you still have a chance to just replace the motherboard, but the choices are very, very limited now. I could only find maybe 6 or